Being diagnosed can give people a sense of relief, but it also can bring up a lot of shame. And what we know about shame is that it isn't just emotional, it is physiological. It's a chronic stress response that mimics freeze and fuels systemic inflammation. The body experiences shame the same way it would a physical threat, even though there's no tangible danger present. This sustained state disrupts digestion, burns the gut lining, and contributes to autoimmune conditions and adrenal dysfunction. Shame is a stressful state in the body. Shame is stressful. Shame stresses out the body. So when your lifestyle becomes shameful to yourself, you're just kind of in this closed circuit of stress.
What if everything you've been told about mental health is incomplete? What if diagnoses like borderline or OCD or ADHD or even autoimmune diseases aren't fixed pathologies, but instead nervous system adaptations to an overwhelming world? Welcome to the season 4 finale of Trauma Rewired, the podcast that teaches you about your nervous system, how trauma lives in the body, and what you can do to heal. I'm your co-host, Elisabeth founder of brainbase.com, an online community where we use applied neurology, somatics, and emotional processing for behavior change, resilience, and personal growth. And I'm also the founder of the Neurosomatic Intelligence Coaching Certification, an ICF-accredited course for therapists, coaches, and practitioners who are looking to bring that deeper level of nervous system work into all that they do.
And I'm your co-host, Jennifer Wallace. I'm a neurosomatic psychedelic preparation and integration guide, and I bring your nervous system into peak somatic experiences so that you can experience embodiment safely to receive messages from the body for growth, healing, and expansion. I'm also one of the educators at the Neurosomatic Intelligence Coaching Certification. This season, we've redefined mental health through a neurosomatic lens. We've unpacked how complex trauma and nervous system dysregulation intersect with mental health illness, neurodivergence, physical health, and systemic oppression. Today, we're going to look at our biggest insights, the themes that connect these conversations together, and how will we integrate this information and share with you also what's coming up next.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation. It's a big one. We covered so much this season. And so as we were preparing for it and trying to consolidate all of this and connect the dots together, there's just a lot to cover here. So we're going to be going over high level, just what some of our biggest insights were. And we'd also love to hear from you guys in response to this conversation. What were your biggest takeaways, feedback you have from us, and really keep this an open conversation.
Yeah, it's a big one. So thank you all for joining us as we explore today. And I think one of the biggest themes that we explored is really like, what's the cost of chronic stress on our cognitive function, on our presence, and on our memory? And we recorded individual conversations on anxiety, on burnout, on memory. And when we talk about the cost of chronic stress, we are not just talking about feeling overwhelmed or burnt out. We're talking about a full body, full brain disruption that alters how we think, how we remember, and how we exist in the world. Chronic stress comes at a high price, especially when it comes to cognitive function, presence, and memory. And so let's start with cognition. When stress becomes chronic, it floods the body with cortisol, which over time suppresses the hippocampus. That's the part of our brain responsible for learning and memory consolidation. That means it's harder to form new memories, harder to stay focused, and harder to access the information we do know. On top of that, the prefrontal cortex, which governs our executive function, goes offline. That part of our brain that helps us make decisions, problem solve, and to be fully present gets hijacked. And presence gets sacrificed almost immediately. Chronic stress pushes the nervous system into constant threat assessment mode. When we stop experiencing the now and start living from survival patterns that are shaped by our past. This is how dissociation happens. This is why time disappears. Words get lost, the world gets lost. And we find ourselves looping in thought spirals. The nervous system is stuck in protective reflexes that were built from earlier traumas. When that stress response stays active, it affects how memory is stored and recalled. Cortisol disrupts the hippocampus while activating the amygdala, the alarm system. So instead of forming clear narrative memories, the brain encodes sensations. What you are left with are implicit memories, a racing heart, a tightening throat, a shutdown reflex in your body, when something in the present echoes a trauma from the past. The story may be gone, but our bodies remember.
Yeah, I think that these first few episodes were so important in really looking at how that chronic stress load, like you said, it disrupts our focus, our ability to learn, and it really leaves our system under-resourced because we're expending so much energy all of the time when we're living in these high stress states. And that these can come from many different avenues, right? We have the trauma patterns that our system has developed over time, the imprints of those past experiences that leave us in a more hypervigilant state. It changes the way that our brain interprets our own internal sensations, other people's expressions, their vocal tone, their posture, their facial expressions, the environment that we're in. All of our sensory inputs are being filtered differently in a way that creates more stress in the system. And then we also have cultural components to that too, right? Hustle culture and the need to perform and financial stress and big systemic stressors like racism, oppression, gender bias, sexism, like all of these things that are creating this constant high stress load, the way that our society is, right? Like we don't get enough movement, or we're looking at screens all of the time. It's a fairly dysregulating world. And then we really started to see how at the root of so many of the outputs that we're looking at throughout the season, whether those are mental health outputs or physical health outputs, we have that underlying stress load that people really need to know how to work with, how to repattern, and how to process some of that stress so that we don't move into these bigger outputs.
That's right. And then, like, when we're talking about healing, what's often missing for people, and it was for us at a time too, is the role of rest and recovery. And rest and recovery is not just a sidebar. It is a central part of the process. We're conditioned to push, to perform, to produce. And when we can't keep up, that blame, it turns on ourselves. But burnout, functional freeze, chronic fatigue, and even depression, they're not personal failures. They're protective outputs from a nervous system that's over capacity. And burnout, it's when that flame starts to die, not because our passions are gone, but because we are depleted from a level of our energy and our fuel systems. And then we have functional freeze, where it's the state where technically you're functioning, you're showing up, you're performing, but emotionally shut down, disconnected, unable to truly engage. And it's a masking, honestly, and it's exhausting to mask and to pretend. And all of this over time can tip into chronic fatigue or depression, where your system just says no more. And what's important to understand is that healing doesn't happen through more doing. It happens in the pause. Recovery isn't passive, it's active. It's when your nervous system gets to metabolize stress, your body starts to repair, and your brain rebalances. So whether it's sleep, time in nature, slowing down, saying no, or reconnecting to safe people, relationships, rest is not optional. It's the space where integration, safety, and true transformation occur. And when we honor our capacity, when we don't shrink ourselves, we actually create the foundation to grow sustainably and in alignment.
Yeah, I think that is so important. Honoring our true capacity and developing a different relationship with that. And then also recognizing that rest can sometimes be inherently threatening for people when we're patterned for this high stress state from all of our past experiences. And it can really feel quite threatening to slow down. And so learning to work with our system in this minimum effective dose way, weaving in little breaks throughout the day, regulating around that rest, taking a few moments out in nature, starting to make these gradual changes in our habits, in reteaching ourselves this skill of modulation, of coming down into rest and recovery and repair, and doing even that in a way that it meets our capacity to be able to rest, right? And not expecting ourselves to move into that too quickly. And then I really think also about the episode we did with Veronica Rotman on the female nervous system and relating to this as well, and how much that is ignored through mainstream wellness, and how, there are very different cycles, hormonal cycles, energetic cycles, metabolic rhythms for the female nervous system, and that so much of that is ignored in a lot of these kind of blanket prescriptions for nervous system health that then are really actually leading us to deplete our resources more. And that also, too, we can go into our healing, like you were talking about, from that same place of dysregulation, trying to meet these imperfect standards that aren't really customized to our own system. And we're healing from that place of dysregulation and overriding the systems that we're trying to support, right? And so we talk a lot on here and in NSI about how neuroplasticity requires safety, but that safety can't happen, or it requires resources, but that can't happen when we're stuck in that high stress state. And so really starting to reframe that rest is not a weakness. It's a space where transformation happens, and that we can't move into our healing practices with that same sense of urgency and push that we might be used to doing, that it's gonna take some reframing and pausing and slowing down.
Yes, I've experienced this firsthand. And physiologically, women are more complex the way that we are designed. And I think in that fluctuation, our capacity also is shifting and flowing. And what I've witnessed in myself and with clients that I work with that they come into somatic work already depleted. They're trying to push their way into transformation. They want change way faster. And it's a freeze response that can look like apathy, forgetfulness, and emotional numbness, when really it's a body protecting itself from further depletion. Rest isn't a reward, it's a requirement for repatterning. And for me, rest has become an act of rebellion. It's a way of honoring my body's pace rather than forcing it into the rhythm of capitalism. It's a lot of undoing. And as we have said so often this season, repatterning doesn't happen in hypervigilance. It happens in stillness, in softness, and in slowing down long enough to feel again.
Yeah. So maybe even as you're listening to this episode, just taking a moment to have a little pause, like just take in some of that information, take a breath, take a nice long slow exhale, let it settle over you, and see if you can just start to incorporate these tiny pauses throughout the day as a way to start to gradually undo some of this.
That's right. And some of our biggest exploration as far as a series this season was also exploring neurodivergence.
Mm-hmm.
And complex trauma is a neurodivergence. Like, I remember the moment that was just like blew my mind. It really hit me as a truth. And it was also like, duh.
Yeah. Totally.
And we talk about being in the vortex of trauma rewired. And with every episode, there were some surprises for me this season and how I related to, quote, mental illness from the way that it's viewed from society or by others. And neurodivergence is something that we've really explored pretty heavily this season and had some great takeaways. I'm honestly still in the depths of understanding the way that my brain has developed under chronic stress, because that in itself was it was just huge for us to understand that complex trauma is a neurodivergence. If you've been listening to Trauma Rewired, you already know our nervous systems predict safety long before our minds can catch up. And belief systems, they're not just cognitive, they're embodied. That's why Elisabeth Christoph and Matt Bush are hosting a free live workshop on July 9th called The Neurosomatics of Leadership and Belief Change. This is for coaches, therapists, and practitioners who want to move beyond cognitive models and work at the root level where change actually happens, the nervous system. You'll get the latest science on how predictive coding shapes your clients' beliefs, how to retrain those patterns safely, and learn how to integrate NSI into your work for better outcomes. Join us live July 9th. Save your spot at neurosomatic.com/leadership. That's neurosomatic.com/leadership. We would love to see you there and deepen this work together.
Yeah, I feel like that was one of the biggest key takeaways, like one of those big light bulb moments for me this season, when we had that conversation with Dr. Megan Ann Neff, the autism expert, and we were talking about neurodivergence and sensory processing. And we'd been reading all of the books, Divergent Mind by Janira Nuremberg, and really exploring our own neurodivergent presentations and the way that we process sensory information and finding all of these intersections of different neurodivergent identities and different neurosomatic tools. And there was this moment, I think it had been on the tip of our tongues, like in our bodies, coming into our consciousness, when she said, complex PTSD is a neurodivergence. And that, like you said, it was like, yes, duh, oh my gosh, because our brain has been altered in the way that we process sensory information because of the waters we were swimming in during our development, and the way that our brain developed, the neural pruning that took place or didn't take place during that time of high stress or emotional neglect or any of the other environmental components of what A scores create. And then after that episode, you reached out to me and you were like, we need to have an episode on this. So we brought Matt in and we started really exploring that and breaking it down in a lot of depth. But it really shifted the way that I see myself and the work that I do with clients to think about that. And it also started to open the door for me for more self-compassion about some of the ways that my brain works differently because of my complex trauma. And that was really neat to experience.
Yes. And we talk about, and in that conversation with Matt, we talk about synaptic pruning, and it's really fascinating. At birth, every human brain is neuroabundant, overflowing with trillions of neural connections, more than we could ever use in a lifetime. This abundance is a gift of possibility. Through a process called synaptic pruning, the brain gradually refines itself, strengthening the pathways we use the most and eliminating those we don't. It's not about loss, it's about adaptation. Our experiences, environment, and the safety of our relationships shape what stays and what goes. This pruning is how the brain becomes efficient, but it also means that repeated experiences of trauma, of stress, or neglect can hardwire threat responses into our neural architecture. When we understand that neurodivergence may reflect a different pattern of pruning or connectivity, not a deficit, it changes everything. It reminds us that diversity and brain wiring is not a pathology. It's part of our evolutionary brilliance.
Yeah, I think that like this neurodivergence isn't a deficit. And I love the term that Matt uses of neuroabundance, right? It's the presence of more or different neural connections, not less. So then we start to shift, seeing autism or ADHD or OCD, or rather than seeing autism or ADHD or any of the other ways that we have been shaped by our complex trauma as necessarily disorders, it's about really starting to recognize them as expressions of a very richly wired brain that processes and perceives and responds to the world differently. And neurodivergent brains often retain more of those synaptic connections, or maybe form unique patterns of communication between different brain regions, especially in sensory or emotional processing systems and the interoceptive systems. And so that means there's more input, more data, more stimulation, which can be overwhelming, especially if you're talking about navigating through a world that's really built for these quote unquote neurotypical processing speeds and filters. But that abundance is not brokenness. It also leads to different ways of thinking, different types of creativity. And it's not always coming from our trauma either, right? There's a part of it that is just natural biodiversity. It's the way that intelligence is expressed differently in different brains and different nervous systems. And we happen to live in a paradigm that doesn't always embrace that, and that can make it quite difficult to navigate, especially with the sensory overload, and also some of the shame and the cultural constructs and ideas that are put on to people who think and process differently. So when we start to shift from that lens of pathology or disorder more to an adaptation, then we can see it as something beautiful about biology, right? This testament to the brain's incredible range and capacity. And like I said, this really helped me shift my own relationship to myself and the way that my brain does function a little bit differently. I have some presentations of ADHD or some presentations of alexithymia. I also have, I can relate to a lot of different outputs that would be linked in some of these neurodivergent categories. And what I really love about this growing movement of celebrating neurodiversity is that there's so many people kind of claiming these identities, coming together around it and celebrating celebrating the uniqueness and the diversity of it. And so when I can tap into that, and then I can also see that my complex trauma shaped some of that neurodiversity in me, maybe makes me a little bit more creative, helps me connect some dots differently, create different offers for the world, then I can honor some of the gifts that I have received from my past experiences. And I'm starting to reduce some of that shame, and also at the same time dismantling some of these structural systems that reinforce that shame and harm me from the inside out by developing that new relationship.
Yeah, it's completely relatable. When I think of like complex trauma is a neurodivergence, I have been able to find myself with a sprinkle of just about everything. So it just completely makes sense. And like you said, I just get a lot of grace for myself. And, when we reflect on nature, nature is biodiversity, right? If everything was the same, nature would die. And I reflect like that's how being human is too. So I hope that the Neurodivergent series really gave people a new breath of life and gave them some grace for not just themselves, but the way that we view people in the world, because it has been really beautiful to see the different expressions of humans being more visible in the world.
Yes, I agree. And I do want to say here too that, all of these identities and presentations fall on a spectrum, and we recognize that there are different places on that spectrum where life can be much more challenging than how it may present for us. So we want to recognize that that's very real and a very different lived experience, and we're not trying to put all of that in the same experience category. And then also, too, it really emphasized for me this fundamental idea of NSI that N equals 1. So when we say that, we mean like one, everybody's nervous system is unique, right? In a study, they reference the number of participants by N. And so in this case, we're saying N is 1, like you are the study of your unique nervous system, and really reinforced for me why it's so important to not just have blanket nervous system tools that should work well for everybody, because our brains are so different and we process sensory inputs so differently, we interpret them differently, and then we experience different outputs. And so it made me more committed to the framework of NSI, that we're always assessing and reassessing and being curious and keeping in mind that really big truth that everyone is very different and how they respond is different. And so we need to be able to customize and really be able to work with the nervous system that's in front of us.
That's right.
And if neurodivergence reveals the way that our brains uniquely process the world, then I think also the conversations that we had about physical outputs like autoimmune disease, chronic pain, and metabolic dysregulation also show us how unresolved stress and trauma take root in the body, and they shape our biology. And it's very also unique and individual. And those impacts are just as profound as the way these experiences affect our brain function. And I think the chronic pain episode was really interesting, an important one for bridging that space between our experiences, our emotions, and our physical outputs, because we're really reframing looking at everything as outputs. And these things can get so compartmentalized. There's my physical outputs, like my pain, or my illness, or whatever the physical output is. And then there's my emotional and mental health outputs. And then there's my social outputs, or the outputs in my business. Like we group these into different categories and we break them apart into these silos, but that's not the way our nervous system, brain, and body really work. They're all woven together. There are emotional components to chronic pain. There are mental health impacts of chronic pain. They're all rooted in the same neural patterning and dysregulation. They're all expressions of our nervous system state, of the way that my brain is processing information. And the outputs that it's producing are a reflection of that. There are trauma underpinnings and stress underpinnings to all of this. And so we kind of wove through this big range of outputs. Some are very physical and some are classically mental health, but there was this thread going through everything. And I hope that that's what people take from this season, that like red thread of nervous system health and brain health and stress regulation and emotional regulation that is tying together all of this.
Yeah, what I've come to understand about chronic pain is that it often comes when our emotional body is dysregulated and our nervous system is in a constant state of protection. And repressed emotions like anger, grief, anxiety, they don't just disappear, they get stored. And when they don't have room to move, they build tension, constriction, or inflammation. They show up as pain. And sometimes the pain is there instead of the emotion because pain becomes the distraction. It's easier to focus on than the internal world that we're taught to disconnect from. And I've seen this play out with clients and family members over and over where back pain mirrors an emotional load that somebody has been carrying. Pelvic pain tied to early trauma, or something like TMJ from bracing against life and against feeling. And it's oftentimes chronic pain and illnesses are often the body's way of just saying enough. But like we're taught by society and our culture that we've already been through, is that we are taught to push past that and push through that. And what we know about the brain is it gets better at what it does. And so if you get better at pushing through pain, you just get better at feeling pain and pushing beyond it.
Yep. And in some of the episodes we did that were looking at some more disease outputs like autoimmune and the metabolic health episode, I think it was really a couple really important things came up there. And that was that like dysregulation isn't just psychological. It's not just our anxiety or our thoughts, but it's like cellular. It's affecting the way that our body produces energy, and that metabolic dysfunction is underneath, and the inflammation is underneath so much of the disease outputs, that constant energy depletion and inflammatory response that's going on. And then I think in the autoimmune episode too, it was really important that we looked at relational stress and how that relational stress, and we've talked on here so many times about CPTS being an attachment wound, but how deeply dysregulating that relational stress is. And when we don't have the tools to navigate it, to repattern it, our body is going into these constant, really big states of dysregulation. And a lot of that comes with big inflammatory responses and immune dysfunction and dysregulation. And so you see so many links between times of relational stress and big flare-ups of autoimmune. And then also this big link between people who don't have the skills to process emotions, or navigating, setting and maintaining boundaries is really difficult, or there's just that high stress load with relationship and connection, leading to the development of autoimmune over time.
And we've had conversations around a lot of shame. Shame comes up a lot on the Trauma Rewired podcast. And when it comes to shame and diagnosis, like being diagnosed can give people a sense of relief, but it also can bring up a lot of shame. And what we know about shame is that it isn't just emotional, it is physiological. It's a chronic stress response that mimics freeze and fuels systemic inflammation. The body experiences shame the same way it would a physical threat, even though there's no tangible danger present. This sustained state disrupts digestion, burns the gut lining, and contributes to autoimmune conditions and adrenal dysfunction. And when we had Luis Mojica on the podcast, I really love what he says about shame, because shame is a stressful state in the body. Shame is stressful. Shame stresses out the body. So when your lifestyle becomes shameful to yourself, you're just kind of in this closed circuit of stress.
Yeah. And really that coupling too of the diagnosis bringing a shame response with it, right? We talked about that in our episode on shaming diagnosis. And we also talked about that with Piper when we were talking about beliefs and identity, and how diagnosis can be really helpful because it can give you a community to connect to. It can feel like you're less alone in the experience. It can bring you resources. And there's this component of it can be overcoupled with our identity, like I am diseased, I am broken, I am too much. And so all of that, as we're starting to navigate healing, can really lead to a high shame response, especially if you're someone with CPTS and that you have that hypervigilant shame response. And so it is really important to start to question that narrative, start to somatically process and work with the nervous system around some of that. And then also, it is just a big hope of ours that this season will allow people to have a little bit more curiosity around some of these diagnoses, to start to just like little by little question some of these paradigms and frameworks and the identity that it's created for them in a way that opens the door for more self-compassion, more shifts in the way you have a relationship to your body and to the outputs that you've experienced. Because even just that cognitive reframe can start to do a lot in combating some of that shame that comes with diagnosis.
That's right, because you just vocalized many limiting beliefs. And this is not what we want to be swimming in our thought system around any of the way that we are or the way that we believe ourselves to be. And limiting beliefs comes up also in the conversation with Christy Nault around gut function. And it was a driving factor for me to work on my gut, because I thought, if I do all this rewiring cognitively and in my body, but I live in states of, say, constipation and constriction, and we know that the gut holds so many of the same neurotransmitters and hormones that are released through the body and in the brain, then all of that limitation, those repressed emotions, those thoughts, they're also being constricted in the gut. And so it's a really full body experience to rewire your beliefs, and the way that we believe about ourselves is a really big deal.
Mm-hmm. And I think something really important that kind of ties into what you were saying, especially like when we start to understand all of this stuff and start to see the connection between our gut health and our stress load and our shame response and our relational stress, is that it is important to understand this. And like I said, that cognitive reframe can really open the door, but also understanding it is not the same thing as actually working with it. Like, I can understand how my nervous system works, and I can actually work with my nervous system. So I hope that this is also a path to starting to find practitioners, or joining us at rewiretrial.com, or finding any kind of practices that support you to actually begin mobilizing and taking some of these awarenesses and working through them, again, in that paced, calibrated way that you have capacity for, but really bringing it into life.
And that's so true, because like in my own healing and the work I do with others, I learn this truth over and over again. Like, naming the trauma is not the same as healing it. We can tell our story, we can understand it cognitively, explain it in perfect language. But unless we bring the body into the process, unless we allow the trauma, the sensations, the emotions to move, we stay in the same protective patterns, looping through the same nervous system outputs. For years, I thought awareness would be enough. I thought that naming the trauma, making the connections, and, quote, doing the work would bring relief. But what I found is that the more I stayed in the narrative without tending to the somatic experience, the more dysregulated I become, or continue to wire the pathway for those patterns. And my nervous system couldn't catch up with my insight. And I was re-traumatizing myself by going too far, too fast, too deep without safety or regulation. And what shifted everything was learning to pause, to feel what was happening in the now, and to listen to my body instead of trying to fix myself. And instead of going back to the root story over and over again, I started building safety in the present moment. I met my body where it was, not where I thought it should be. And that's when I started to really understand what it meant to mobilize trauma, not to relive it, but to gently support its movement, to breathe with the constriction instead of overriding it, to cry when I needed to express emotion when I needed to in the now of an experience. And rest is still something that I'm working with, but I'm really understanding the signal to be soft with myself and to understand what it is really to be full and to be felt fully in the experience of now. And healing is not explaining. It's not in the explaining. It's in the experiencing. And when that is safely and slowly with compassion and understanding my unique capacity.
I think that's really, really important. And it is kind of one of the differences in NSI versus some other modalities, is we're not always like diving back into the story, into the trauma, going into the root, but we're really working with the nervous system, the body, and the brain in that present moment? How are the imprints of my trauma, my neural patterning, my neurotags, like how are they showing up now in my life in this moment through the outputs that my body is expressing to me and the way that my nervous system speaks to me? And can I work with that in the moment, gently, slowly, using tools, using somatic practices, a little bit of movement, a little bit of sound to start to repattern a different experience, and doing that repeatedly over time, rather than like, I need to go back and have this big cathartic experience, or I need to dive all the way back into everything, especially when we haven't developed the capacity in our nervous system for that kind of experience. It can definitely be re-traumatizing. And I'm not sure if we're just doing that over and over again. Are we really repatterning the way that we move through the world now versus like working with ourselves in real time to repattern actually how I'm experiencing the world on a day-to-day basis?
And I think when we're talking about, well, I know when we're talking about repatterning a survival response or something that we don't like in the way that we behave, like that is going to call for a new action and a new belief rewire. And so a lot of times I think people get caught in the way that they quote self-sabotage and don't understand that that is just the brain getting you back onto a path that it knows when the stress level gets too high, we do this. And so training using the NSI tools and creating that safety, it has a profound experience and on our neuroplasticity and the way that we can shift the way that we show up.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we talked about that a lot in peak somatic experiences and integration. And then we also, besides the physical outputs, we also dove into some bigger mental health outputs and presentations and diagnoses. And that was new for us. That was a different, deeper dive than we've done before. We looked at OCD, we looked at personality disorders, especially borderline, and a lot came up in that experience.
A lot of emotional repression and regulation were big themes throughout chronic pain, OCD, and borderline. And, when it comes to OCD, what we learned is that compulsive behaviors don't just show up randomly. They emerge as attempts to regulate, overwhelm, dissociation, and emotions that don't feel safe to process. If we weren't given the tools to safely experience emotions, the nervous system finds another outlet. And often this looks like ritualized behaviors or rigid routines acting as temporary relief and a really false sense of control. And what we learn more about shame is that shame becomes a central force. Shame drives cycles of perfectionism and the fear of rejection, reinforcing the narrative that something is wrong with us. And it makes it harder to feel, to express, or even to recognize our emotional needs. And that repression, what the nervous system can't metabolize, it gets rerouted into behavioral loops. And this is why nervous system regulation and emotional processing are essential. We can't just cognitively override compulsions. We have to go into the body, build interoceptive awareness, and increase our capacity to be with emotional sensations without the nervous system perceiving them as a threat. Emotional expression is a skill. It's one we can train. And once we create safety in the system, those loops start to turn the volume dial down a bit. Mm-hmm. And I want to be clear that with this work, it's not about eliminating all compulsions or behaviors. That's not the starting point. We start with regulation by finding a new foundation of safety in the body, because the more we understand these patterns were developed for protection, the more compassion we can bring to ourselves and the more power we have to create lasting change.
Yeah, another big thread there underneath a lot of these outputs that we looked at was a component of sexual trauma, sexual abuse, early childhood sexual abuse. And we dove into that a little bit more heavily this season as well. And that, of course, links with everything that you're talking about with the ability to express and regulate our emotions. It links to the shame response we were talking about. And one of the things that I think was so important is to just highlight how prevalent this is, right? And not just for women and men. It came up in the episode we did with Lovey, Dr. Lovey Bradley. It came up in the episode that we did with Preston Smiles on financial trauma and his history of that and how much he sees that in all of the clients that he's working with in his big somatic containers. It came up talking about the female nervous system and, of course, talking about borderline and how this is really a sadly, unfortunately, very common developmental experience that has massive impacts on our nervous system, on our ability to regulate, on our ability to express and process emotions. And that a lot of times this emotional dysregulation and chronic stress load is diagnosed as a mental health disorder when it is a very non-disordered way of our system responding to the experiences that we've had, the systems and the structures that we grow up in. And yeah, I just feel like it's important. And of course, it was also in our conversation around addiction too. All of these things have some roots of that.
I'm so glad that we explored sexual trauma more deeply because for you and I, it always comes down to that. It's
It
like
does.
when we're talking even about rest and what makes rest unsafe for people, some people cannot literally lay down in their beds at night and shut their eyes because in the body recorded that memory. And it happens sometimes when we don't even have a memory to store, where we don't have that hippocampus development to store a memory of that. We just know that it is threatening to lay in bed and sleep. And even that happens when we're pre-verbal. And I think that you and Molly were so brave in that conversation to share your experiences with us so vulnerably and boldly. And so I just really thank you so much for where you went with that conversation, Elisabeth, because it was, I could just get emotional, honestly, right now. I thought it was beautiful and brave.
Thank you for that, Rasiva. And it was a big one that I had to do a lot of processing around. It was scary. It was scary, right? It was
Yeah.
scary for a lot of different reasons. And I think also, too, you shared the same level of vulnerability when we did our episode on addiction. And we both, and Brooke as well, all talked about our history of addiction. And again, this reframe of not why the addict, but why the pain. And we can see those big states of dysregulation and chronic stress and a system that really needs relief that then drives those addictions. But I also want to thank you for everything you shared in that conversation.
Thank you, because it is certainly a journey. We recorded that conversation. I think I was only a couple of weeks into healing a cannabis addiction, and now I'm at a month. And in the beginning, it just looked like crying every day from morning to night. And there is no way that I could have even started to embrace this level of healing without having tools and knowing that, not just cognitively, but knowing in my body that emotions are safe and I can handle that. And it's not to say that I still don't catch myself at times when I repress or suppress something. Those are well-worn paths, like any other behavior. And unlike any other pattern, I work to rewire it. And that takes time and space. And if I can catch it in the moment, I work with it. I can reflect with high levels of awareness later and then honor it when I need to. It just doesn't get too overwhelming because it can really compound in the body and trigger thought loops or even trigger emotional reactivity. And I lived in such reactive places for the first 30 years of my life. And so I know what that looks like. I know what it feels like when I behave that way. And it has really driven, emotional reactivity has really driven wedges in relationships that are really important to me. And those are relationships that I have spent years trying to mend now. And so it's not very challenging to connect the dots there. But one of the biggest things for me is to lean into interoceptive training for better accuracy, because when I want to go deep in my body, it's a new practice to avoid shutting my eyes because I can feel so much sensation that will trigger dissociation. And what I've really reflected a lot on the PTSD conversation that we had with Matt earlier in the season and the fear conversation a lot, because I think about how it relates to my brain development and how new research on PTSD suggests that it's not the trauma itself, and I think this goes back to sexual abuse also, because it's not the trauma itself, but how the brain and nervous system respond to it that determines whether someone develops PTSD. Fear memories begin as a broad, emotionally charged impression, but over time in a healthy nervous system, they become specific episodic memories, properly categorized in time and space, For individuals with high anxiety, CPTS, and chronic dysregulation, this shift just doesn't happen. The result is a persistent, overgeneralized fear response that colors the present moment, and it heightens the risk for PTSD. And this overlap between PTS and CPTS, it becomes more apparent when we consider freeze response and dissociation, which is totally relatable and common with all of us, any of us who have chronic trauma histories like sexual abuse. And so without access to the body's internal sensations or our interoceptive system, trauma becomes nearly impossible to process. And it's not that the trauma didn't happen. It's that the body didn't have the capacity to safely integrate it when it did. So it lingers, not as a story we remember, but as a sensation to relive. And then how easy it is from there to enter into a personality disorder or an addiction.
Yeah, that episode with Matt on the new emerging PTSD research was so interesting and really validated some of the things that we talk about a lot on here, is that trauma isn't the event, it's the imprint, it's the way that our nervous system and brain have been patterned to respond, and that these quote unquote disorders are not fixed personality traits, but they're that frequently occurring reaction from the patterning that happened from the trauma. And then why a little developing body and nervous system growing up in chronic stress from any of the ACE scores or anything that's not included in the ACE scores, that is that stressful developmental water, then would be primed to be more affected by acute instances of trauma and not be able to have the same resilience and recovery because of the way that we are now patterned and all of those trauma imprints that have shaped our system. And I think it's just so important to reflect on that and then to think about how the repatterning goes. Like you said, really working on the interoceptive accuracy and not just awareness, but the accuracy of that. And then I also think a huge component of the season that I want to make sure we touch on is looking at the collective nature of trauma, at systemic oppression, and really remembering that trauma is political, it's embodied, it's systemic. And as we started the season by, challenging the narrow scope of what mental health is often reduced to, some of those dominant narratives we looked at, like it's a chemical imbalance or a fixed diagnosis or personal pathology. And when we really started to unpack some of these as outputs, anything from anxiety or depression all the way to a cancer diagnosis, and we started to really look at that through a neurosomatic lens, a really big truth became undeniable for me as we examine this, is that it's not isolated issues, right? It's definitely not just in our mind. It's an adaptive output, but more than that, it's collective. It's a reflection of the systems that we're living in. It's beyond just individual trauma. It could be collective or ancestral, and the disconnection that comes for us from that. And one of the key things that stood out to me as we were talking more about collective healing was this idea that mental illness is, I don't know exactly how to say this, I don't want to be offensive, but that mental illness is often a reflection of an inability to process emotions, grief or rage. It's the emotional expression that hasn't been available. And that is not just happening on an individual level. It's happening culturally. Our society lacks the emotional capacity to hold and regulate a lot of what we're experiencing, especially right now in these really highly charged times. And we see so much evidence that a vast array of mental health issues that we're facing also have this component here. And so I thought that was really important to examine, and it really came up for me in the Prentice episode.
Oh, I loved that conversation so much because, something that you've said before is that the oppressor, the abuser doesn't want to feel your emotions back, right? They can't handle that back in their faces. And I think that goes for, we see it in a small scale in our maybe familial relationships, but really we need to look at that from a broader perspective, because in a system where emotional pain is dismissed as irrelevant or pathological, the very human condition becomes medicalized and it reduces people down to their symptoms. And that is a false narrative, and that is intentional. And this is one of my favorite quotes by Prentice.
If you're a practitioner, coach, or therapist who's noticed that cognitive strategies only get your clients so far, you're right. Change doesn't start in the mind, it starts in the nervous system. That's why practitioners from therapy rooms to Fortune 500 coaching programs are using neurosomatic intelligence tools to shift beliefs and identity at the root. Leaders in the world of coaching like Kate Northrup and hundreds of practitioners around the world have integrated these methods to accelerate breakthroughs for their clients and for themselves. Join me and Matt Bush for a free live workshop packed with actionable strategies you can start using right away. The Neurosomatics of Leadership and Belief Change on July 9th. You'll learn why your clients' nervous systems, not their thoughts, drive their behaviors and how to work with that for faster, deeper transformation. Register now at neurosomatic.com/leadership. That's neurosomatic.com/leadership. I can't wait to see you there.
This is one of my favorite quotes by Prentice. This moment and all moments require our presence. It is a deeply courageous act to show up in this time. Presence is not a steady state. It's about a million permissions and moments of forgiveness, of audacity. Presence is a state that we can be in, but it's also a field we can enter into together. My invitation is the cultivation through practice of presence. So more and more of us can meet in that place, show up to this time, and become the people that I think this time really needs and requires.
Such a beautiful quote. And it
love them.
sums up so much about what's at the heart of this season, right? The emotional undertones, the collective, and we talked a lot in that episode about the collective inability to process fear or grief, and how there's a general lack of emotional maturity that creates so much or perpetuates so much trauma. And then we're all reacting to one another from these states of dysregulation that rob us of really being able to be present. Collectively, we don't have the capacity to hold these emotions. And so I think throughout all of this, there's so much beyond just the framework of input, interpretation, output, and starting to look at things differently. The way all of these things are outputs of the way I take in information about the world, my brain interprets them. But there's this real crucial piece here of the emotional component of that, of emotional inputs, of the interpretation of emotional sensations and our ability to express and mobilize emotions. And again, just I think about everything that's happening in the world right now. There's a lot of stress and emotional charge for many people, financial, political. And so there really is an invitation that I love that Prentice extended to expand our capacity to stay present in the time so that we can have growth from these experiences and be able to collectively move into a space where we can feel that full human experience.
Yeah, because trauma can be really isolating. And so people go into healing with that same concept where it's like, it's come up in so many conversations, even in our peak somatic experiences conversation, the idea that we do all this individual work, always turning inside. And we can't just do that for ourselves. We do that for relationship. We do that for others. We do that for our communities and the collective. Healing is not an individual experience. It's a relational experience. And with the isolation of trauma, and validly, right? It's a valid reason to move through. It's scary to try and make connections when you've been programmed to self-isolate and to even be heavily involved in your self-development. It can also be isolating, but we need community. Healing happens in community, and this came up with Dr. Taylor Shanae, and they're a somatic therapist that specializes in birth trauma. We had a big conversation with her, and it ended up not just to be around birth trauma at all. And what was fascinating was that she talks about birth as a traumatic event, but also as a portal for healing. And they helped us unpack how the nervous system is imprinted from the moment we enter the world, and how systemic factors like medical racism, gender bias, financial barriers keep trauma in motion across and through generations. And one of my favorite parts or one of my favorite things about that conversation was when she was talking about ideologies, whether we're talking about white supremacy, cis heteropatriarchy, classism, ableism, that these ideas are often floating in space ideas, right? But they're not floating in space. The reality is, this is what she says, is that in order for an ideology to become a function of society, of a group, of a family, of a person, it actually has to take up residency somewhere. And that residency happens in our bodies. It informs our bodies on how they move. It informs the body how to eat, how to rest, how to sleep, how to breathe, and how we relate to each other, how we explore pleasure, how we procreate. And so there's a very layered experience to existence that requires a body to have an ideology. And then there's the practical application and meaning to that, right? And so it's really a lot to pull apart. It's layered and it's deep.
It really is. That was such a kind of mind-blowing conversation for me to think about that, these ideologies taking residence in my body. And it also made me think about something that we talk about quite a bit in the NSI course, is because we are looking at these big structural and systemic traumas. And the truth is, like, those things are real. They exist. There is a chronic stress load that is different for different life experiences. And we want to be really careful that we're never saying, just use your neuro tools and you can make all of these things go away, right? Because that is not the truth, right? There is a component that has to come from bigger collective societal change. But there is also a component of working with our nervous system and working somatically in a way that disrupts that internal landscape, the way that these systems of oppression have been patterned into our own bodies, that is liberatory, right? Like, there is justice work in that, because when we're talking about these things taking up residence in our bodies, in our nervous system, in the subconscious patterning of our brain, then we are also kind of upholding those as we keep perpetuating those cycles and those responses. So if I can start to create shifts in those beliefs in an embodied way, in those identities and these ideologies inside of myself, inside of the way that my body reacts when I'm pushing up against those ideas, in a way that I can have more self-expression, or I can move out of these ideas of body hierarchy or financial patterns, I'm really starting to build something new in me. My body is carrying like a new possibility for responding and moving through the world. And there is a component of that that's like, as within, so without, right? If we all start to deconstruct this inside of ourselves, that is collective healing also. And we're contributing to the creation of something new.
Yeah, it was fun to explore financial patterns this season because that's something that we've not done before. And it was received so well from you. So thank you so much for that. Because, you know, we talk about when you're wired for something, like, say, wired for fear or wired for anger or grief, like that's the easy pathway, that joy would be the threat, right? Excitement would be the threat. But when it comes to financial patterns, if you're someone who's living in scarcity, abundance is going to be the threat. That is the financial pattern that we are rewiring for, to understand, not just in a life sort of way, but like in the actual money. And Preston was just brilliant. It was fun to explore financial patterns.
Yeah, something that came up in the Preston episode that I want to touch on, because this kind of leads me into what we're going to be talking about next season. We're going to be talking a lot about emotions and processing different emotions in the emotional landscape, but we're also going to be talking about post-traumatic growth. And Preston said something in that episode that has come up before on here, and sometimes there is a mixed response to this, and I totally understand why that is. But he mentioned that trauma is a gift, right? Like, it's an invitation to grow and to expand. And there's that beautiful Peter Levine quote that trauma unhealed is hell on earth. I'm paraphrasing and misquoting here, but trauma unhealed is hell on earth, and trauma transformed is a catalyst to an expansion of consciousness. And so I do see why it's very challenging to start to reframe and look at some of these experiences as gifts. And I don't know that I necessarily am saying like trauma is always the gift. I see many places where the event has overwhelmed someone's capacity to cope in a way that they weren't able to come back from. I've lost many people to their trauma and to their addiction, beautiful people that I grieve for, that they're not with us anymore. And I also see that there is an invitation there to expand myself, and to maybe the trauma isn't the gift for me, but like I am the gift. How I utilize these experiences to alchemize, for lack of a better word, generational trauma that has lived in my body so that collectively we can expand. It's what shaped me. It's what has made me who I am. And it's what has birthed things like this podcast, NSI, brain-based. And so I want to start to open the conversation around that, because we will be going into post-traumatic growth in the future.
Yes. And, that is definitely something that we get some flack for, that trauma is a gift. And that is not a concept that I started with. It's a concept that came to me once I got far enough along into something else, into post-traumatic growth. And it takes integration is the word I'm going to use. Like, it takes safety, it takes integration, it takes presence and healing relationally and all the things that we have talked about. And, integration is, I think, something really important for people to understand, because it's not something that we do after an experience. It is something that we are living in this moment right now. It's a process that we are always engaging in. And the brain is an integration machine. And you said it, as within, so without. The more I have adapted to integrating my brain and rewiring the processes and lighting up various parts of my brain and learning about my survival brain and all of those things, the better I am at integrating peak somatic experiences or whatever healing that I am engaging in. And so integration happens in many different levels. It happens in the body, in our nervous system, in our brain, in our emotions, in our belief systems. And it's how we try to change the way that we live our daily lives. And, it also means, I think, welcoming back parts of ourselves, right? Parts that have been exiled during trauma, parts that have been fragmented, maybe parts that fawn or that shut down, ones that get angry or dissociated, parts that freeze. And integration is saying, you're part of me too. And I can manage that. I can hold all of that now. I couldn't do it before, but NSI gives me the capacity to be open to that experience in my body. And so, when we have had a powerful experience, whether that's in somatics, neurodrills, tapping, emotional breakthroughs in relationship, or psychedelics, we can't just move on. The nervous system needs repetition enough to safely say, okay, this was real. That was a real experience. And I have tools to bring this into the here and now and maybe start to create a change in those belief systems, in the way my body moves, in postural ways. And it's a practice of coming back to over and over until the body really understands that, like, this belongs here. And the brain is like, okay, like, this is what we do now. And when we're talking about psychedelic experiences, then we're talking about a whole other expansive state of consciousness, of understanding in the body, of different breakthroughs, perhaps. And so afterward, we have to do the work to bring those new awarenesses actually into our nervous systems and bodies. And that means grounding it into the body, moving it in and through the body, and having support, right? We're making meaning here, and we're making change. It's not just about what happened in the experience. It's about how we live and move differently because of the experience. And honestly, I think that's where a lot of people get stuck. They chase the peak and forget the practice. And when we're talking about the brain as a prediction machine, it's going to take you right back to where you were if you're not putting these tools into practice and the awarenesses. So whether we're talking about emotional work, nervous system healing, psychedelic journeys, the thread that runs through all of this is that healing happens when we make the space, when we create the safety and the practice of staying with it. This is integration.
I think that's so beautiful. The really thinking about the integration of everything, right? The daily practice of it, the integration of this season, right? We've taken on a lot, and now we need some time and space to start to integrate and process all that has come. And we also want to give you guys, our listeners, some space to integrate and digest all of this information. So we will be taking a break, and then we'll be coming back for the next season. And I think we've just touched the tip of the iceberg on peak somatic experiences. So I have no doubt that that will be coming up as a part of that season as well. And then we're going to really dive into exploring emotional awareness, capacity to stay present with our emotions, diving into all different types of emotional experiences, the neurology of that, the somatics of that, different presentations like alexithymia. And then also, again, looking at the phases of growth, post-traumatic growth that come from that, and seeing if we can start to find ways to create expansion, growth, capacity from all of this. Because again, it's not necessarily the experience that was the gift, but like you are the gift. You, the listener, are your presence here, being curious and exploring this and walking this path. That is a gift.
I'll tell you, it's a vortex I'm really excited to jump into, because you guys, you witness so much of us like in our past state, and it's really not actually the way that we kind of live. And I'm excited that we'll be exploring cultivating emotional awareness, building the capacity to stay present in an emotional landscape. And that can be the very thing that rewires the brain and restores somatic wholeness and creates conditions for post-traumatic growth. We'll look at how the nervous system encodes emotions, how to safely work with emotional expression, and how emotions, once processed, become a force of transformation, creativity, and authentic embodiment. In the aftermath of trauma, emotions are often viewed as something to manage, suppress, or to get past. But what if they are really the gateway to healing? Not the thing to avoid, but the thing to move toward. Because emotions are not just reactions, they're data. They're messengers from the nervous system signaling our body about safety, about our needs, our boundaries, and really about unmet truths. And when we begin to explore these emotions with curiosity instead of judgment, we can unlock the very adaptations that kept us alive and begin to understand the story of our body and that what our body has been trying to tell us. Post-traumatic growth isn't just about getting through something hard. It's about expanding into more of who we are. It's not about the absence of pain, but the emergence of purpose, the emergence of perspective and inner capacity that wasn't there for us before. It's our emotions, especially the ones we've been taught to fear or the ones that we've taught to silence, that initiate this process.
Yeah, I think that I'm so excited to dive deep into the emotional landscape. And I have been over here doing a ton of research in affective neuroscience, and I'm really excited to share that with everyone. We have some incredible guests that are coming. We're going to dive into maybe less discussed emotions like disgust and jealousy. All of these things will be there. We'll definitely look at some of the positive emotions too, like joy, and it'll be a really fun and interesting season with just a lot of exciting exploration to come. And like I said, we'll be taking a break to integrate, but you don't have to be disconnected from us. We'll still be around. You can join us at rewiretrial.com and come hang out with us on the Brain-Based site and start putting some of this into practical application. We'll have all kinds of workshops that are coming up. And as always, too, we'd love for you to share this podcast if it resonates with you and there's someone that you think would benefit from it, and give us your feedback. As we're moving into this new season, we love to hear from you. We want to know what you want to hear about. If there's people that you think would be great guests, connect us. We're so open to that, and really excited to continue on the journey together.
Yeah, thank you all so much for joining us this season. It was a big season for us, and we are really looking forward to a new season and sharing, maybe exploring a little bit more the gift of what we have experienced and what it has birthed and what that potential holds for you as well. And so we're really grateful to walk this path with you and to be in your ear. It's not something that we hold lightly. In fact, the way that you receive us has been a lot of lessons for us, and the way that we receive positive feedback and the way that we receive compliments and the way that we receive joy within our own bodies has been not always, it can still be a little bit threatening, to be honest with you. And so we're learning with that as well. And so we're just excited to share with you what we've learned. So thank you.
Thank you all. We'll see you soon.